Dunkirk very unfamiliar typically with most American audiences, and I was wondering what that conversation was like at Warner Brothers when you said, yeah, I want to make this big film about something most Americans have never heard of.
I didn't pitch it like that. Jesus.
In the film industry, there's a common saying, one for them, one for me. It describes how a director makes one film for the studio, and will use the money they receive from that production to make a passion project. And out of all the incredible movies in Nolan's filmography, I would say that Dunkirk, more than any other, was his one for him. Even before he became a director, he had wanted to make a movie depicting the events of the Dunkirk evacuation. It was an event that he felt deserved a larger presence on the world stage. And despite the concept seeming to lack mainstream appeal, Warner Bros. Would have been stupid not to give Nolan what he was asking for, especially considering the run he was on at this point. His past 4 movies had been a $1 billion superhero movie, an $800 million heist film, another $1 billion superhero movie, and a $700 million sci-fi space adventure. He had proven that he was more than capable of writing and directing different kinds of stories, and much more importantly to the studio, he was immensely profitable. Keeping that in mind, Warner Bros. Sent him off with $100 million and plenty of faith in his passion project. And upon release, this faith was immediately rewarded. Dunkirk made over $500 million and was universally praised by critics. Some went as far as to call it not only Nolan's best film so far, but also one of the greatest war films ever made. On top of all that, it was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, and for a while, it seemed like Nolan might finally win Best Director. While this didn't end up happening, Dunkirk still did win 3 awards, and was clearly well respected by audiences everywhere. Fast forward to today though, and Dunkirk is probably one of the last films brought up when discussing Christopher Nolan. It didn't prove to have the staying power of movies like Inception, Interstellar, or the Dark Knight trilogy. Why was this the case? Why is Dunkirk often forgotten among Nolan's filmography? Today we'll be finding the answer to that question, and in the coming weeks, I'll be taking a look at each film in Christopher Nolan's stellar filmography. If that sounds interesting to you, feel free to subscribe. Now without further ado, let's get into Christopher Nolan's passion project, Dunkirk. The story of Dunkirk's development begins in the mid-90s, when Christopher Nolan and his future wife Emma Thomas sailed across the English Channel. Sailing across the same waters where the Dunkirk evacuation took place, Nolan felt inspired to make a film adaptation of those events. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, the Dunkirk evacuation, codenamed Operation Dynamo, took place between May 26th and June 4th in 1940, when British, Belgian, and French troops were surrounded by German soldiers during the Battle of France. They retreated to Dunkirk and planned to evacuate via the English Channel. Completely surrounded and with over 400,000 men to evacuate, all hope seemed to be lost. However, miraculously, over the course of 8 days, they managed to evacuate over 330,000 soldiers. And one reason this was possible was due to the many civilian ships that sailed across the channel to help evacuate the men. Despite losing the Battle of France, the Dunkirk evacuation became a source of pride for the British, with the phrase Dunkirk spirit being used to describe the unity and resilience shown during the evacuation. And then Prime Minister Winston Churchill's iconic "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, delivered in response to the evacuation, permanently etched the event in British culture forever. Nolan became a film director a few years after he had the idea to make a movie based on these events, but he hesitated to make this dream a reality, as he wanted to get more experience directing large-scale action films. And while not exactly a war film, Nolan's experience on The Dark Knight Rises no doubt made him confident that his passion project could now be fully realized. In 2015, he wrote a 76-page screenplay, the shortest script he'd ever written. The length wouldn't be a problem though, as Nolan intended to tell the story of the Dunkirk evacuation through visuals rather than dialogue. He also wanted this adaptation of the events to be extremely subjective. The focus is on the event itself, from the perspective of several characters on the 3 fronts the battle was fought: the ground, the sea, and the air. And we only see these events through their eyes. Where a typical war movie will sometimes cut to generals speaking in war rooms or have fictionalized versions of real people, Dunkirk avoids that for the sake of keeping the focus on the battle as it was seen by those present. A good example of this is in the closing moments of the narrative, where instead of seeing Winston Churchill deliver his iconic "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, it's read to us by our protagonist as he sees it for the first time in the newspaper. While the obstacles our protagonists face aren't based on specific accounts, Dunkirk still has been praised for its historical accuracy. There was one scene that was inspired by a specific account though. As part of his research for the film, Nolan interviewed veterans and was so moved by one of their experiences that he incorporated it into his screenplay. This experience being depicted in the scene where the characters watch a soldier walk into the water, attempting to swim across the English Channel. This was a moment that stuck with me on my initial viewing. and to discover that it was inspired by true events really emphasized just how desperate the situation was. And this plays into being historically accurate, as establishing the proper atmosphere is essential for that. Another important aspect of maintaining historical accuracy and establishing a proper atmosphere comes down to production design. Nathan Crowley returned as production designer once again, and as always, he did a great job. Though some logistical concerns were presented by Nolan's desire to film in Dunkirk, they were able to make it work. While some have pointed out inaccuracies caused by this decision, in my eyes, these don't hinder the movie in any way. One such issue of choosing to film in Dunkirk was that the mole had to be completely rebuilt. They based the rebuild on the original blueprints, and it took about 4 months to complete. Clearly, Nolan was deeply concerned with keeping the setting as authentic as possible, and this desire carried over to his casting choices as well. Another thing Nolan learned while interviewing veterans was just how young and inexperienced they were at the time. To portray this, Nolan decided that he'd cast young, largely unknown actors for the mole storyline. Since the focus was to be on the event rather than the characters, it was important that the actors didn't stick out in any particular way. He wanted them to blend in with the environment and time period. This even extended to the characters' names, with the protagonist being named Tommy, based on a slang term for a British soldier. Now, if you know anything about Dunkirk, you may be questioning that bit about Nolan having a desire to cast actors that didn't stick out, seeing as Harry Styles plays a leading role. But this actually was in keeping with Nolan's philosophy. He apparently didn't know who Harry Styles was and cast him for his old-fashioned face, as he put it. Despite how unbelievable that sounds, it is definitely possible, since Christopher Nolan famously doesn't have a phone. And if I didn't know who Harry Styles was previously, I never would have guessed that his character was played by a pop star. As Nolan put it during an interview, it's not a very glamorous role. Still, Harry Styles did a surprisingly good job. Other notable performances include Fionn Whitehead as Tommy, Barry Keoghan as George, Tom Hardy as Ferrier, and Cillian Murphy as Shivering Soldier. Nolan has a tendency to work with the same actors multiple times, and despite many new faces being cast for Dunkirk, Cillian Murphy and Tom Hardy both were able to return for the project, each having last worked with Nolan on The Dark Knight Rises. Michael Caine also makes a voice cameo as Fortis Leader, marking his 7th straight appearance in a Nolan project. And of course, with actors as talented as these, you can expect a quality performance, and none of them disappointed. That's not to imply that the younger actors' performances are inferior in any way though. Fionn Whitehead does an incredible job as Tommy, the protagonist. Despite not having much dialogue, he makes what little he does have count. His expressions and overall appearance make it clear just how young and inexperienced his character is, which is exactly what Nolan was going for. As for Barry Keoghan, admittedly he has a smaller role, but his character's storyline ended up being the one I was most invested in. And a large part of this is because of Keoghan's performance in the early part of the narrative. As is typical for a Nolan production, there was a large emphasis on practical effects on the set of Dunkirk, and this no doubt helped the young actors as they were able to see and feel what they were supposed to respond to. And the effort that went into the practical effects on Dunkirk is impressive as always. Practical effects were used for small things, like cardboard cutouts of soldiers in order to sell the scale of the evacuation, but they were also used for large things, like the plane crashes, where radio-controlled model planes were actually crashed into the English Channel. At times, this preference for practical effects did put the crew in a tough position though. Since there were no wartime British destroyers left with working engines, a French destroyer had to be made to look like a British ship. For any World War II enthusiast, the differences are fairly obvious, but I still think the decision was worth it. The tangibility offered by an actual wartime destroyer is worth the slight inaccuracy. The practical effects as a whole do a fantastic job of grounding the film in reality. When everything is done for real, it's going to feel real to an audience. The practical explosions and ships help sell the scale of the event, and the cinematography plays a role in establishing the large scale of this story as well. Hoyt van Hoytema returned from Interstellar as cinematographer, and once again did a fantastic job. He would be nominated for an Academy Award for his work here, unfortunately losing out to Blade Runner 2049. Still, the cinematography in Dunkirk is impressive. Dunkirk is composed of roughly 75% IMAX shots, by far the most of any Nolan film yet. The first non-IMAX shot isn't until 17 minutes in. This was actually possible due to the lack of dialogue. IMAX cameras are notoriously loud, so they can't be used for scenes where characters talk in a low voice. Most of Dunkirk either has no dialogue, or the character that's speaking is wearing a mask, meaning that their dialogue had to be dubbed over in post anyway. Speaking of post-production, this process actually ended up being very complex for Dunkirk, and this was primarily due to its unique plot structure. As was previously mentioned, the Battle of Dunkirk was fought on 3 fronts: the ground, the sea, and the air. Dunkirk adapts this idea by having 3 interconnected storylines, one from the perspective of the soldiers on the beach trying to evacuate, another from the perspective of the civilians aiding in the evacuation with their own boats, and yet another from the perspective of an RAF pilot. This sounds simple enough, but the 3 plot lines also take place across different lengths of time, with the evacuating soldiers' story taking place over a week, the civilian story taking place in 1 day on the final day of that week, and the pilot's story taking place in 1 hour, also on the final day of the week. Editing these sections together in a way that made sense and flowed naturally would prove to be an extraordinarily difficult task. Fortunately, longtime collaborator with Nolan, Lee Smith, served as editor on Dunkirk, and he was already familiar with Nolan's unorthodox plot structures, as he previously worked on both Interstellar and Inception. Dunkirk would unfortunately be the last time the two would work together, but it would prove to be an excellent note to end on, as Lee Smith would go on to win an Academy Award for his efforts here. And this accurately reflected the work put in. Between 10 to 15 different cuts of Dunkirk were assembled, and only after a cut was complete would music be added. Speaking of which, the score was composed by Hans Zimmer, and as always, is phenomenal. It fits the tone of the event, that tone being intense, non-stop rising action. And upon release, critics recognized the masterful contributions of everyone involved with this production. As was mentioned, it was lauded by many as Nolan's best film to date. Some even called it one of the greatest films of the 2010s and one of the best war movies ever made. At the time, it was even the highest grossing World War II film ever, at least until it was surpassed in 2023 by Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. From a technical perspective, Dunkirk is indeed a marvel, but that speaks nothing to the fascinating story contained within. A trademark of Nolan's career has been his focus on time, and that is the case with Dunkirk as well. Not just in the plot structure, with the varying lengths of time for each storyline, but also it could be said that time is the true antagonist. While the Nazis are the looming threat, no Nazis are actually seen until the final moments. On the other hand, the idea that the characters are running out of time is an ever-present concept in Dunkirk, and this is partially accomplished through the soundtrack, which features a persistent ticking noise on multiple occasions. The men on the beach are running out of time to evacuate Dunkirk, the civilians are running out of time to get to Dunkirk to help with the evacuation, and the pilot has a very limited flight time due to his rapidly depleting fuel supply. And it was the pilot's storyline, played by Tom Hardy, that was most surprising to me on my initial viewing. I expected it to look and sound good, but it also did a great job of setting up future events. Since this story takes place during the final hour of the evacuation, Tom Hardy's character sees several things while flying overhead that will later play a major role in the other two plot lines. The crossover between these events, if done incorrectly, could have been confusing and actively worked against the film. Since Tom Hardy's story is an action-packed hour, if sequenced poorly, the constant rising and falling tension could have made it difficult to become invested in the larger plot. But instead, the incredible editing ensures that the tension between sequences matches up, which actually makes it easier for the audience to become invested. The ending of the air section also proved to be one of my favorite parts of the narrative. On my first viewing, I didn't understand why Tom Hardy's character didn't land sooner in order to evacuate with the men on the ground. But on my second viewing, I understood the tragedy of this moment. Tom Hardy's character actually thought of ejecting after shooting down the Nazi plane. However, he eventually decides to close the hatch and stay in the air. And by the time he finally lands, he's all alone on the beaches of Dunkirk, where he's later seen being taken by Nazi soldiers. And he could have done this for two reasons. Firstly, he may have stayed in the air for the simple reason of being able to potentially thwart any future attacks. The second reason is a bit more nuanced though. It was unlikely that another air raid would happen in the short time it took to evacuate the remaining men. However, the pilot may have stayed in the air in order to boost the morale of the men on the beach. Throughout almost the entire evacuation, they've had no air support and were subject to bombing at any time. We saw this firsthand during the opening. Knowing that they finally had some air support likely brought the soldiers a measure of comfort, and the pilot may have sacrificed himself with this thought in mind. While I did enjoy the air storyline, I think my favorite is the second one, the sea, taking place in a single day, and there are a few reasons for this. Cillian Murphy's performance as the unnamed shivering soldier was phenomenal. One of the biggest and only complaints I see levied towards Dunkirk is that it's lacking any kind of emotional core. It's a film that will dazzle the audience with its visuals and make them think with its plot structure, but some say that it's unlikely to really make you feel anything, and a big reason for this is because of how intentionally generic the characters are. The focus is on the event rather than the people, and while all of this is true, in my opinion, Dunkirk is also home to the single most tragic moment in Nolan's entire filmography. When Cillian Murphy's character realizes that the boat that rescued him is headed toward the battle at Dunkirk, he attempts to forcibly take control of the ship. In the process, he accidentally severely injures Barry Keoghan's character, George. And the moment this happens, Murphy's character is no longer aggressive toward them. He's completely distraught by what he's done, and repeatedly asks if the boy's going to be okay. And the audience is wondering the same thing. While we don't know much about George, we do know that he was never supposed to be here in the first place. He only came because he wanted to be helpful. And through the few lines he's had up to this point, he's proven to be an innocent child. He can't seem to comprehend what the soldier has gone through, and as we're wondering as to whether he'll be okay, we seem to get our answer. He plainly states that he can't see, and this line serves to take the audience off guard. This is absolutely tragic for sure. A young boy has gone blind due to an unfortunate accident. It's so tragic, in fact, that it seems to be a fitting conclusion for this plotline. That's why when he's suddenly pronounced dead, it's a complete shock to the viewer. Just after this, Cillian Murphy's character yet again asks if the boy's going to be okay, to which the other boy simply responds with, "Yeah." That one moment is probably the single most depressing in Nolan's entire filmography. The performances all around are incredible, the dialogue is perfect, and the shock of it all is heartbreaking. And this is all made even more tragic during the ending, when Cillian Murphy's character realizes the boy died. The ending also adds another interesting wrinkle to this moment. When Tommy and Alex are about to get on board a train back home, there's an old man passing out blankets and telling the soldiers, "Well done." As Tommy passes by, the old man puts his hand on Tommy's face, revealing that he's blind, which may at first seem to be a superfluous detail. In screenwriting, though, it's safe to assume that nothing is done by accident. So what is the purpose of this character? Also, Nolan didn't accidentally put two blind characters in his movie, meaning that there has to be a connection between the two. A lot of people seem to think this character is a World War I veteran, but that actually wouldn't make much sense. The actor who plays the blind man is John Nolan, Christopher Nolan's uncle who's made appearances in a few of his other films. He was 79 at the time of filming this scene. Dunkirk takes place in 1940. World War I began in 1914, 26 years prior. Assuming his character is around the same age, he would have been fighting in World War I in his 50s. While technically not impossible depending on his rank, it is extremely unlikely. To me, that rules out that possibility, meaning that there has to be a deeper reason for his appearance, and I believe I found two. Firstly, he serves a very simple narrative purpose as he shows how the British people felt toward the events of Dunkirk. He was simply happy that the soldiers survived, regardless of the lost battle. And secondly, there's the connection to George. All George wanted was to do something, as he put it. And that something in this case was he just wanted to be helpful. The only reason George even brings up the fact that he can't see is because he thinks he's no longer useful. And just after this, he dies. And this blind man only emphasizes that tragedy. The blind man shows that even if George would have been blinded for life, him surviving would have been good enough. George still could have been helpful as he always wanted to be, despite being blind. But unfortunately, he was never given that opportunity. The reality of the situation highlights the cruelty of war. A young man killed in an accident while trying to save those serving his country. It can be described as nothing less than a tragedy. Dunkirk does seem to end on a primarily positive note though, with Tommy triumphantly reading Winston Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, while the soldiers are warmly welcomed back. But it's important that the audience doesn't forget one simple thing. Wars are not won by evacuations. On my first viewing, I felt mixed about Dunkirk's ending. All the losses were tragic, but for the most part, the music and atmosphere set the scene of a victory. The music builds to a triumphant crescendo as the scene fades to black, leading to the obvious transition into the credits. But that's not what happens. Instead, there's a quick shot of our protagonist looking around anxiously, and then the credits begin to roll. While I wasn't sure what to feel up until that moment in the ending, that shot made the meaning of the ending clear. While yes, the Dunkirk evacuation was a miracle, it was just one of many battles in the worst war in human history. The war would go on for another 5 years afterward. While to the civilians at the time, Churchill's speech on the power and might of the new world and the continuation of the fight was a source of comfort, to the soldiers just returning, it was a reminder. A reminder that it wasn't over, and that they'd just as soon be sent off to battle once again. And this is the realization Tommy has in this moment. While the events of the Dunkirk evacuation make for an incredible story, for those who are actually involved in it, the story didn't end there. The reality is that a lot of the survivors were simply sent off to fight again. And to put that in terms the audience can fully understand, that kid that we've grown attached to throughout this film's runtime will eventually have to go off and fight once again. Still young, still largely inexperienced, and still with his greatest desire being to simply return home. Aside from Following and Insomnia, Dunkirk is the film I see discussed the least in Nolan's filmography. With Following, it's understandable because not many people actually watched it, and Insomnia is by far the least Nolan movie. But Dunkirk has all the trademarks typical of Nolan. It's a movie no one else could have made, and it was endlessly praised upon release. Its reputation hasn't gone down much, aside from the typical recency bias going away. It's not that people hate it now or it's become underrated. It's just that no one talks about it. And I think the reason for this is simple. Nolan films tend to leave a very strong impression, and Dunkirk does that as well, but it's just not as strong as Nolan's other work. It's competing against one of the greatest heist films ever made, one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made, and Batman. It was never going to survive those discussions. But this isn't a knock against Dunkirk's quality at all. It's just got some tough company. Still, Nolan's passion project was a resounding success, even if it gets lost in his catalog nowadays. He had already proven that he had great range as a director, and that was only further established when he made an incredible war film. 3 years later, he'd follow up this project with what is often labeled his only misstep to date. In 2020, Christopher Nolan released Tenet, by far his most contentious project yet, and that's what we'll be discussing next week. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.